a time of heightened tensions between Beijing and Washington over the DPRK's nuclear ambitions, U.S. President Donald Trump signed a White House memo ordering a probe into China's intellectual property practices. In response, China stated that it would take necessary measures to safeguard its legitimate rights. Many analysts believe the action is political. While Mr. Trump tests the limits of China-U.S. relations, who will bear the brunt of a potential trade war? To discuss these topics and more today, I'm happy to be joined here in the studio by Charles Liu, who's the founder of HAO Capital, Xige Lian, a senior consultant of the Anjie law firm, and Andy Mogg, founder and managing director of Red Pagoda Resources. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui. But before we get started, let's take a look at this.
With a stroke of his pen, U.S. President Donald Trump takes another step towards pressuring Beijing over allegations of intellectual property theft. He's asking his top trade official, Robert Lighthizer, to examine whether Chinese policy warrants formal investigation.
Ambassador Lighthizer, you are empowered to consider all available options at your disposal. We will safeguard the copyrights, patents, trademarks, trade secrets, and other intellectual property that is so vital to our security and to our prosperity.
China requires many foreign companies doing business in China to create joint ventures and share their technology. That has long bothered those who don't want to lose their. Beijing warns any unilateral penalties could lead to a trade war.
Trade measures taken by any member of the World Trade Organization should abide by the rules of the WTO. We have said repeatedly before that as China and the United States are increasingly interconnected with their interests closely entwined with each other, a trade war will get them nowhere, nor will it have a winner, but only leads to a lose-lose situation.
Welcome to Dialogue. What do you think of the timing of President Donald Trump's announcement?
I think it is at a very sensitive moment when a lot of things happen in both the economic and the political area in both China and internationally.
Well, that's a short enough answer. Andy, what are your thoughts about the sensitivity of the timing and circumstances against which this presidential memorandum was signed in the White House by Donald Trump?
Well, I think it comes at a time when the Trump administration is under tremendous pressure on all sides, domestically and internationally. So, of course, internationally, there's the crisis with the DPRK. Domestically, the Trump administration is beleaguered by the Mueller investigation, some of his controversial comments around the Charlottesville violence. That's really at a very, very difficult time, but as you say, also a very sensitive time for U.S.-China relations.
I wonder, Charles, if you have read a recent article posted on financialtimes.com that the United States will be a dangerous country in that he is using some of the alleged external threats to try diverting public attention from domestic woes to the alleged self-fulfilling prophecy, like the DPRK, Taiwan, which has been used at the beginning to trade with China about the problems between the two largest economies.
I don't think the United States is going to be a dangerous country, but Donald Trump is certainly a very dangerous president. What has happened domestically in terms of Charlottesville? Charlottesville shows the divide in the country is extreme, and both sides have automatic weapons. Things will happen and can happen, and what he's done in the last couple of days is even worse. On the trade issue with China, I think, number one, nobody said anything about 301 in the announcement, including his entire cabinet and including Donald Trump himself in the announcement on the executive order. It is the beginnings of an executive order to begin a study of what may be. So I'm looking at a year of studies and nothing will happen. You're absolutely right about this is diverting attention from his serious domestic problems. He also has to throw some bones at his base, namely, oh, we're doing something about China.
I think, yes, I'd like to jump in very quickly. I think the point here, though, is that Trump's bark is worse than his bite in this, in that it is the investigation to decide whether there should be an investigation of China. So in fact, he's backing off from his initial threat. So I think, in a sense, if we look at it from a U.S.-China trade relations perspective, this is actually a positive for the relationship, but I think it demonstrates the weakness of the Trump administration currently.
Pending investigation, the conclusion will take at least 1 year to figure out whether China has violated any infringements of the intellectual property rights. Having said this, Guilian, what is the Section 301 of the U.S. Trade Act of 1974?
That is a U.S. domestic law, the Trade Act. The Trade Act 1974, and it authorizes the USTR to actually regulate unfair trade practices of other countries. It gives the legal grounding to USTR to investigate and take actions.
Our Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Hua Chunying says, in response to the press, trade measures taken by any member of the World Trade Organization should abide by the rules of the WTO. We have said repeatedly, quote, before that, as China and the United States are increasingly interconnected with their interests closely intertwined with each other, a trade war will get them nowhere. Andy, what do you make of the statement?
Well, I think it's very true. And, to return to this theme that Trump's bark is worse than his bite, in this application of 301 is that, first of all, the other part of that is that this list of retaliation products that are on this retaliation list cannot damage the interest of consumers, firms, or employees in the United States. And precisely because these two economies are increasingly integrated, we can imagine that any product put on this list, there probably will be an outcry, resistance from American companies, employees, or consumer groups that are adversely affected. So I think that will also act as a restraint on the Trump administration's ability to actually implement anything under.
It seems the United States has always been very reluctant, A, to go to the UN Security Council for a settlement of the multilateral disputes, and B, go to WTO for a settlement of the bilateral trade disputes. So it only believes in its own domestic law. That's likely to cause a lot of scrutiny from those who are involved in a trade dispute with the United States. Charles, what do you think of our concerns?
I think absolutely. If they ever attempted to apply 301, 301 was really hitting the Japanese in the 1970s in terms of the auto exports. And of course you can hit Japan because you got 100,000 troops sitting there and you basically run the country. But you can't do that anywhere else. And if you're looking at this, if they ever attempted to run 301, all of EU and others are going to be in an uproar because it is totally against international rules and regulations. I think the situation here is he needs to throw some bones to his base because he made so many promises during the campaign and he's not delivering on any of his promises. And in terms of China trade, as Andy said, the integration of the two economies are such, and the supply chain and the value chains are so integrated, he cannot, or the administration cannot do anything without having someone being hurt in the U.S., not just in China.
If the presidential executive order would only be part of the extension of the presidential campaign, then should we take domestic politics very seriously? As you have indicated clearly, he signed the executive order to respond to his die-hard supporters, the electorate.
Right, except that this is so soft in terms of studying and whether or not to study.
Well, I think, as Charles was saying, I mean, it's an investigation to whether there should be an investigation, I think, is the first point. The second point is that it's really focused on IPR, intellectual property rights, whereas his base, I think, really cares about manufacturing jobs. Right. So if we're seeing something where Trump is responding or looking to meet his election promises, we would expect to see more targeting of steel, aluminum, these types of direct manufacturing jobs. So I think it's a little curious on the one hand, the choice, but clearly there are many companies, there's a large constituency in the United States that does care about intellectual property, but these are not the people that elected Trump.
Well, look, what do you think of the most controversial part of the current debate between the United States and China regarding Section 301? The alleged Chinese coercive approach of forcing technological transfer for more of China's market shares here. I mean, this has caused a lot of grievances from some of the American multinationals and perhaps European ones, that they are afraid their property has been the victim of IPR thefts, quote unquote.
I think President Trump is making the situation very complicated. It is very easy to make an accusation, but it may not be very easy to find the evidence and the facts. We never say China's IP protection system is perfect. It's far less perfect. There are a lot of defects, and but for example, there are a lot of controversies about China's regulation on technology import and export. There are provisions of the law, say, for example, improvements of technologies by the Chinese companies must belong to the Chinese companies, and foreign technology licensors must indemnify Chinese licensees from loss caused by the imported or the licensed technology. So these rules may be not perfect, may not be right to the understanding of some people, but it is hard to say these rules actually force U.S. companies to transfer technology.
Here is an angle for us to look at what's going on between the two largest economies. One is a war. It's a Thucydides trap between the rising power and the established power, and therefore the U.S. will do whatever it can to slow down China's economic expansion, which might somehow challenge their maritime primacy and the global leadership. The other discourse, I'm afraid, is legal battles. Now, legal battles would have to be based on a case-to-case study. So are you confident that China will be able to win the battles? But for the war, no one can predict precisely whether we'll be the winner or not.
I think whether or not China wins individual battles is irrelevant. I think the war is already in the direction of China being the winner. Because if you take a look...
Come on, he's so optimistic.
I am, because if you look at, for example, China's manufacturing capacity is now the equivalent of Japan and the United States combined. And in terms of just not only a question of trade balance, it's a question of how rapidly China has developed new technologies. Look at mobile payment, for example, and many other sectors.
Quantum computing,
yes, quantum
supercomputing.
China's far more advanced. But of course, China is a big country, 1.4 billion people. Not everybody has caught up to the 21st century.
But we are getting old before we get rich.
Yeah, well, there's some others who are getting rich who are not as old as us. So
India is catching up very quickly.
Yes, you can say that, but India has its issues. India has great aspirations, but whether or not it will, 25 years ago, it's the same GDP as China. China was $1 more. China is now 6 times bigger.
Andy, what do you think of the approach employed by President Trump to settle the disputes? Is it more about domestic law, or should he go to the WTO for the trade dispute settlement mechanism?
Well, I think there's a couple of issues here, and I think it's really impossible to neatly separate them, because domestic politics, of course, matters to any American politician, and by every indication, Trump is looking for a second term, at the very least, to promote the Republican Party in the 2018 congressional elections. I think he genuinely does care about the economic position of the U.S. vis-a-vis China and the rest of the world. So any tool at his disposal, I think, is fair game. I think one policy he is pursuing that, in a sense, is learning from China is that not just pursuing purely a multilateral approach, but looking at these bilateral agreements, not just with China. Pulling out of TPP, I think, is an example of that. And to go back to your earlier question, who is winning the war? I think Charles makes a great point that China is at the forefront of many important technologies like quantum computing, supercomputing. We look in the world of startups. Silicon Valley is now learning from China about innovative startup business models, clearly economics. We look at foreign reserves, a lot of these key measures. I think we are seeing not just the rise of China, but frankly the dominance of China.
But the relationship between the government and the market is called into question by many liberals, and don't forget the formidable presence of the enterprises. Will that be a drag on the Chinese economic growth? We'll wait to see what's going to happen next. But you are watching Dialogue with Charles Liu, who is the founder of HAO Capital, Xi Gelian, a senior consultant of the Angel law firm, and Andy Mock, founder and managing director of Red Pagoda Resources. We'll be back in a short while. Please do stay with us. Who will be the guy who shapes the direction of the trade and investment between the two economies? The lawyers or the presidential powers in the White House?
Neither.
Backstop in the White House?
Neither.
Backstop in the Oval Office?
It would not be the lawyers, and it would not be the White House. If you look at intellectual property issues, I've done hundreds of deals in China. It is, in Chinese expression, 一个愿打一个愿挨. It's always party A, party B. If you agree to the terms, you sign an agreement, you go to contract, you go ahead and do it. It's individual cases, and they're all very meticulous with a lot of details. It's not something that the White House can really interject itself into, or lawyers, in this case, are just service people. In intellectual property, if you want to participate in this market, you have to localize your production. This has been there for 30 years, not just in China, but in many, many developing countries. So it means some transfer of technology. For example, selling the F-16 production lines to India also includes transfer of technology.
Charles, you're barking at the wrong tree, okay?
No, but it's the
Any
same thing.
transfer
That's
of
what the
military
American...
technology would be just like killing.
No, but the U.S. transferring technology to the Indians because the Indians are buying a second-hand F-16 production line. Included is a transfer of technology deal.
But that's a geopolitical competition against Russia.
But I think another way
Russia
to look
used to be the partner of India during the Cold War, and the arms race in
It's
developing
geopolitical,
countries
sure.
would gain a lot of momentum in the foreseeable future. This is no exception that a meeting between Prime Minister Modi and his American counterpart resulted in a hefty arms sales deal. So this is an F-16, right?
That's it.
But whether
No,
F-16 could protect Taiwan, I don't know.
No, but I think going back to your question, for those of us who are in real business, who are actually doing transactions, if each individual transaction is valued and weighed individually in detail, is not something that the White House really should interject into.
You know, I'm very pleased to have Gelian here as a professional lawyer and talk about legal battles. However, I have to go back to my point on the war, structural contradictions between the two countries, deep-rooted mistrust, deep-rooted imbalance, strategically speaking. When you look back to Asia, strategic reassurance, the two countries seem to have been put on a collision course, and therefore the alleged Thucydides trap. So what is a strategic solution to structural problems? I mean, mistrust, it will take a lot of time. The United States would, of course, refuse to transfer high-tech technologies or whatever cutting-edge deals. What do you think of this dilemma? I mean, this is a security dilemma for both countries.
Well, I think it is and it isn't, Yang Rui. I mean, because first of all, I think the initiative, and frankly, the advantage lies with China. The reason for that is, first of all, when we look at the Trump administration, they still have not been able to field a full team because his appointments have been blocked by Congress. The administration also has not just been efficient at proposing people. So if you're going to play, if you can't even get your full team on the field, it's hard to win. Second of all, I think there's a lack of unity, not just between the White House and the other branches of government like Congress, but even within the White House itself, there are vying factions for different policies. Whereas when we look at China, it's largely unified. There's an argument for a single party system because everything is aligned with the national interest. And then we look at just size in terms of economy, growth rates as well.
Over the past decades, in their assessment and reviews about the bilateral relationship, the bipartisan assessment in the China relationship has always been protected by AmCham, which is, among all others, the strongest lobby group safeguarding the fundamental interests shared by the two countries. But a few years ago, a representative from AmCham said to me, Yang Rui, I don't think this lobby group will defend this bilateral relationship any longer because we feel increasingly hurt by the alleged intellectual property thefts and violation of IP, so on and so forth. What do you think of the concerns and grievances of AmCham?
I don't quite agree. I would say look back to the China's history of improving in my area the IP protection. We can see a lot of improvements made by the lobbying group of including both international and domestic trade associations, scholars, and of course the industry representatives. We see the amended the patent law, the trademark law, and take the trademark law for example. In the most recent amendment, the lingering headache of many industries has been actually addressed. That is.
Well, you can talk a lot about the positive progress that has been made between the two economies. However, what do you think of the alleged protectionist measures by the Chinese authorities? For example, many American multinationals have been barred from having an equal access to the procurement program that would only benefit state-owned enterprises here in China. But overseas buyers would certainly face double standards, quote unquote. I am citing grievances from overseas competitors here in the Chinese market. Andy, have you ever heard of such stories?
Absolutely. And I think that, some of the disillusionment by the American Chamber of Commerce, the European Chamber of Commerce and its members, I think is justified in the sense that the golden age for foreign companies in China, I think, has passed. And it's not necessarily because of any unfair treatment legally or systemically, but just that the Chinese companies have become such formidable competitors. And when we look in the internet space, Tencent leads with WeChat. I mean, globally, we compare it feature for feature. It's a world leader. We look at Huawei competing in smartphones, again, very effectively globally. So, in a sense, I think the frustration and perhaps the decline in relative attractiveness of China as a market for many foreign companies is very justified. But the solution, I think, while companies will do this, of course, that's why they have GR, government relations departments, but the key is to step up their game, I think, and become, invest more in product development, marketing, and just be better competitors.
What lessons can we learn from Japan in the 1980s when trade war happened between the United States and Tokyo across the Pacific Ocean? Eventually, it's Tokyo that had to make the concession. And do you think in this current standoff, China would be the first to blink?
I don't think so.
You don't think so?
There's no way. Because Japan was never truly independent government managed well into the 80s.
Are you talking about Okinawa, the military presence?
I'm talking about Japan has always been under the thumb of the American government. This is why they accepted the Plaza Accord.
Yeah.
This is why they accepted 100%, 200% import duties on Japanese cars. This is why they accepted all the pushes that Washington had imposed. Now, China is not going to accept that. And what happened is, this is exactly why you had 20 years of nothing, no growth, no progress in Japan over the last 2 decades.
But what would be the worst case scenario regarding the future of semiconductor chips? I mean, chips are, of course, the most important, crucially important things for China.
I was on the board of Applied Materials, the #1 chip manufacturing company in the world, for six or 7 years. And I can tell you, China, this is one sector in which it really needs to get its game up. It is significantly behind global technologies in the chips. And now they are capital exporters, so they try and buy some companies. Now, the Western countries are pretty united in blocking it, blocking any Chinese attempt to get into the chip sector. But okay, it's just like they blocked China in terms of a number of sectors. The Chinese then ended up developing it themselves.
Like in the supercomputers.
Like in supercomputers and quantum computing. And even if you go back to the military side, when Khrushchev told Chairman Mao that you don't need to develop nuclear submarines because we're there to protect you. So in 4 years, China developed its own. You know, China is a big country with the resources. So
following the bombing of the Chinese embassy in Belgrade, we quickly developed our own cruise missiles.
Exactly. So you actually have a situation in which there's very little that China cannot do by itself. Of course, companies, you accelerate the process.
Look, the last question is not really directly about the trade war. It's about the DPRK.
Yes,
He's wise enough
to
quickly figure out what I want to ask. In fact, China has promised to honor our commitments to the UN Security Council by banning some of the critical items that we import from the DPRK. This does have
critical
its
for
own teeth.
DPR for China, iron ore.
That's
so
what I
on.
mean.
Yes.
So, do you think the United States and China has actually been held hostage by this rogue state, quote unquote? That's the term by President Bush.
The only thing that you can look at is the U.S. would like to have a zero-cost solution for them, which means you let China be the bad guy. What does that mean? If you push hard enough in terms of sanctions, you lead to not a regime change, but a regime collapse. Regime collapse means 1.5 million armed North Korean military storming into South Korea and storming into China. Or if there is any attempt to start anything military, South Korea, Seoul, 20 million people, is 65 kilometers from the 38th parallel, with 65,000 pieces of artillery facing that.
Potential chemical weapons as
chemical
well.
weapons,
Yeah.
biological weapons. And if you cannot deliver a nuclear missile or atomic bomb by missile, you can certainly pull it by train to the 38th parallel.
But I'm afraid the more dangerous scenario would be any failure or serious setback by the White House or other players to stop the DPRK from developing its nuclear ambition. Then there's likely to be a very expensive nuclear arms race in Northeast Asia. That will be
Japan
devastating for the stability and peace of this region.
Yes.
Thank you very much for being with us in this part of dialogue on the trade war between the United States and China. Of course, it's around to politicize and poison trade between the largest economies. We'll keep our door open for next round of discussions on this sector. Goodbye.